Hello and welcome. We trust that you had a wonderful break. As we enter 2025, we are reminded of the revolving economic challenges and opportunities that continue to shape global financial markets. In the next while, our chief economist, Sanisha Packirisamy, and myself will be taking you through some of the key economic trends to watch out for in 2025. Sanisha, towards the end of last year, you published an extensive report which looked at some of the more unexpected events that happened in 2024 in the political and economic spheres, such as Donald Trump's resounding presidential victory and the improvement in South Africa's electricity crisis. The report further listed 10 key trends to look out for in 2025 on the local and global front, and most of these were stemming from developments in 2024. The World Economic Forum also publishes an annual report looking at the global risks. The report for 2025 has not been published yet as we film today, but of the top risks that were mentioned in the 2024 report, which of them are likely to persist in the 2025 report?
Thanks, Tshiamo. So the World Economic Forum publishes this Perceptions of Risk survey once a year, and they divide it up into two components. So the first is on longer term 10-year risks, and the other is on shorter dated 2-year risks. And when we look at those 10-year long term risks, I think many of these are going to populate the table for the 2025 report, such as things like climate change and how that impacts your underdeveloped economies, things like the adoption of artificial intelligence and technology, and the fact that regulation is not really keeping up with that. There is one risk that I don't think is really highlighted on there that I would add, and that is essentially around aging demographics. So many countries around the world have not got proper immigration policies in place, and this is going to hamper labor forces further down the line. Now, when we look at those 2-year or shorter term risks, I think, we really see inflation there quite prominently. But in this world of Trumponomics, I think there is, a view out there that we are going to enter a more reflationary environment. Now, it's true that some of the policies that Trump has stipulated may actually be deflationary in nature, such as deregulation or increasing fracking, which will bring down energy costs. But by and large, things like the immigration policies and tariffs are going to have more of an inflationary impact. And I think the market has already cottoned onto this. If we look at the Fed futures, they have already paid back the expected interest rate cuts for the year. So when we wrote the report, the market was looking for 3 interest rate cuts by the end of this year. At the start of this year, it was paid back to 2 interest rate cuts. And now Fed futures are almost pricing in 1 interest rate cut. So, we are now sitting at the middle of January as we film, but I wouldn't be surprised, in the next couple of weeks that the market could potentially even take out any form of interest rate cuts for the US Federal Reserve. And we know that monetary policy is largely dictated by the United States. And so that means that the prospect for further easing in other markets, such as Europe, may actually be off the table for this year.
Another interesting outlook report is published by the Euro-Asia Group, which was released in early January, but this one focuses on political risks as opposed to the World Economic Forum, which takes a more macro approach. Are there any political risks highlighted in this report that caught your attention and you had perhaps not highlighted them in your 2025 outlook report?
Well, we always make this joke that when we're talking about the year ahead, it's not very long before you start using the T word, which is Trump or Trumponomics. And so, just like any other year ahead report, Eurasia Group's report also focuses on all the ideologies behind Trumponomics. So, the trade developments that are likely to stem from there, the change in foreign affairs. So, a lot of that, I think, we did capsulate quite well in our own report. There are ever 2 risks that I would highlight, such as the ungoverned spaces, which is one of the 10 risks that they spoke about. Now, ungoverned spaces really talks about those areas of the global economy that are left behind as we get these centers of powers emerging. So a great example of this would be Sudan. And the war there started around April 2023. And the United Nations came out saying that around 11.5 million people have been displaced after this war has taken place. And so we are likely to see that more and more, we'll see a global rise in inequality, more poverty emerging. Now, these are things that don't necessarily hit the headlines, but I think this is a key risk that we do need to contend with and governments need to be aware of going forward. The other key risk that I think do underlie our economic forecast, but we didn't really tease it out as a specific risk, would essentially be the AI unbound risk. And this really talks about regulation lagging artificial intelligence and technological advances. And a key example of this would be what happened in Europe over the last couple of weeks, where the underground sea cables were damaged. And that's an example of cyber warfare that has taken place. So I'd say that those risks, we have sort of taken that into account when developing our economic forecast, but didn't really tease it out as specific risks as noted in this geopolitical report.
Let's focus a bit more on Trump. During the holiday break, there were a few legal developments. One, he was found liable for sexual abuse and defamation in a civil court. Two, there was also a finding of civil fraud regarding his businesses. Moreover, he was the subject of 2 federal indictments, and he was indicted in a state election interference case in Georgia. How will these cases impact Trump's political standing and influence, both in the US and on the global economy, if at all?
Well, we're still expecting that on the 20th of January, we're about a week away at the time of filming, that Donald Trump will take oath to become the next president of the United States. And that does speak a little bit to a 2-tier justice system in the United States, unfortunately, for a number of reasons. So the first, and this is really why I think his case was treated more favorably, even if it was just a normal civilian, probably would have gotten a fine or imprisonment. He is still seen as a felon now in the law's eyes. However, he knew the federal judge that he stood before. He was given the opportunity to appeal to the Supreme Court, of which, 3 of those judges he had appointed. And then lastly, there is also a financial angle here. There was a legal fund that was set up that was both publicly and privately supported for Trump's case. Now, he will be able to still become president and put through all the policies that he wants to. But I think, the real angle here is that there are big question marks around the independence of the criminal justice system in the United States. And it is just yet another nail in the coffin for democracy in my eyes. So if we look at, the chart that we're displaying at the moment in terms of the depreciation in terms of the view on how independent are judges and prosecutors in the United States, this has fallen in the last while. And I think that this will be a continuous trend in the next couple of years under a Trump regime.
Following the US elections, we discussed the likely political and economic consequences of a second Trump term. Since then, have there been any new development in terms of Trump's foreign policy approach? I ask because it seems that his strong comments about reclaiming the Panama Canal, annexing Greenland, and making Canada the 51st state of the United States has upset many world leaders.
So not uncommon. We've seen that Trump has made many very bold statements, and it always ends up in backlash by other world leaders. And I think that this is a little bit of a negotiation tactic from Trump's side. So I think he sort of scares the opponents, puts them on the back foot, and then gets them back at the negotiation table and then goes after the goal that he really wants. Quite often we've spoken in these events where we listen to geopolitical strategists out there like John Hulsman, and he's noted that in 2016 there was a reporter that really spoke about how Trump's dynamics played out with his allies and his opponents. And he basically said, that some of his allies take him seriously, but not literally, but the opponents take him literally and not seriously. And I think this is really playing out at this point in time, where they need to take, cognizance of what he really wants to do in the case of these 3 areas. And so if we look at the Panama Canal as an example, this is a key waterway for goods to be traded from the west of the US to the east of the US without having to go the route via Argentina. So there's an economic consequence that results from that. The Panama Canal was also built by Americans and then sold off at a later point. Now, going forward, I think what he really is after here is to ensure that he can get trade at the lowest possible cost. There's an additional angle, and that's the Chinese angle, because there are Chinese firms that are operating at either side of the canal. And I think what he's really after is to push those Chinese firms out, even though he might not actually reclaim the Panama Canal. The second issue that he spoke about was Greenland. And we know that the Prime Minister of Denmark oversees that region and said that that region belongs to the Greenlanders. However, they don't really protect it in terms of a defense system that's there and present. And I think that the US wants to have some kind of security presence in Greenland. There's another economic angle to that, and Greenland is very rich in mineral resources, especially your rare earth materials. And we've already seen that some Chinese companies have entered into venture capital arrangements in order to extract those rare earth materials, which are crucial for modern tech industries. And I think that's essentially where Trump wants to come in again. The third angle is on Canada. And if we look at Canada's performance, it's actually been quite dismal over the last while. Outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, during his term, Canada's real GDP per capita dropped from 80% of that of the US down to 70%. And a lot of Canadian growth is still very reliant on the US economy. So when Trump says, they act as a 51st state, he is not 100% incorrect on that statement, because a lot of their prosperity does in fact come from the US economy. Now, I think taking all three of these economies together, we also need to realize what Trump's stance is here. I think he wants to take greater control of the Western Hemisphere, and it is moving against what the Democratic Party did in the last couple of years, where they focused a lot of attention on the war in the Middle East or on Russia, Ukraine. And those regions didn't really have much of an economic impact for the US. Whereas if we look at Greenland, Panama Canal, and Canada, and consolidating that power in the Western Hemisphere, it does tell us a little bit about what Trump's bigger goals are here in this area.
Speaking of Canada, you mentioned Justin Trudeau as the outgoing Prime Minister. Has the news of his resignation surprised the markets? And why is this significant for global politics, especially considering your remarks in your report about the removal of political incumbents in 2024?
We did say that 2024 was going to be a heavily politically driven year. We had 72 elections, of which many of the developed markets saw their political incumbents being ousted. And this is a continuation of that trend that we're seeing now in Canada. I don't think it was, a massive surprise to markets, given where the popularity vote was for Trudeau. That had grinded all the way down to 16%. And for the Liberal Party, which he represents, went down to about 22%. But I think, what we really need to take away from this is, why did the popularity drop to those ultimate lows for the Canadian Liberal Party Prime Minister? And a big portion of this was that he had promoted progressive liberalism 9 years ago when he took the position and promised quite a lot. But many of those policies did not actually come through. Now, we mentioned that one of the reasons that political incumbents were ousted in 2024 was a disgruntled electorate that were experiencing a cost of living crisis. And in Canada's case, it had a lot to do with housing prices and housing costs, as well as immigration. Now, Canada's had big immigration numbers coming through, but citizens felt like there was no coherent policy around that, and numbers were just coming in, crime was going up, fentanyl cases were picking up as well. And I think that really added to citizens becoming very disgruntled with the status quo, with the politicians that were in place. Now, going forward, there needs to be a better response to what the citizens are actually worried about. And in an Angus Reid survey result, they found that 85% of Canadians are worried about the American tariffs that may be slapped onto them in the near future. And if we look at what the University of Calgary has calculated, if these tariffs come through, if the US does indeed put 25% tariffs on Canadian goods coming into the US, that could shave off about 2.6% of GDP, and that could send Canada into a recession. Now, as we look at some other contenders, going into the election later on this year, which is in October of 2025, it looks as though the other contenders are factoring in things like tariffs and what that means for the Canadian economy. So even though, with Trudeau stepping down and there's some other names that are being flouted, such as Mark Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of Canada, even if we do get another replacement, it's quite likely that the Liberal Party won't survive the October 2025 election because they're not quite focusing on the real issues at play, which has a lot to do with the Trump policies.
As we've said before, Trump's harsh comments are a strategy to negotiate trade deals. But now it looks like other options are being considered. For instance, can the rule on undertaxed profits be used by the Eurozone to prevent an economic conflict with the United States?
Definitely, but I think this strategy is going to be deployed elsewhere as well. So if we think about China, we saw that Trump came out with very bold statements in terms of the tariffs that he wanted to apply to Chinese goods coming into the US economy. But again, I think that is a tactic to get China at the negotiation table and say, maybe we'll lower these tariffs, but then you need to lower the concessions on American companies that are operating in China, as an example. Now, with this undertaxed profits rule, there was a pact that was signed by a number of countries, including South Africa, at an OECD meeting earlier on in January this year. And what that basically says is if you have American multinational companies operating in different jurisdictions and paying less than 15% tax, that jurisdiction can then levy a top-up tax. Now, for Europe, what they could potentially say, if they get all their leaders to agree and be on the same page with this, they could then go to Trump and say, okay, maybe we won't do the top up, but then maybe you don't give us such heavy taxes on the European imports that are coming into the US. So definitely, I think, this year we're going to see a lot of bargaining around how trade negotiations are dealt with.
The Eurozone appears to need to focus on maintaining growth in exports due to the domestic, economic, and political challenges it faces. What are the growth prospects for the region this year?
Well, we often talk about US growth exceptionalism, where growth is expected to do really well in the next while for the United States. But the counter to that is that other developed market economies may actually suffer a further economic blow. And I think that the Eurozone is going to be one of those. So we're looking for growth sub 1% in that region for the year. And that's because some of their major economic powerhouses are not doing that well. So if we think about where we can potentially get some growth from, there might be some relief on gas prices and energy prices as those come down. And we know that that took a huge chunk out of consumer pockets over the last while. But the counter to that is that if we look at Germany as an example, they've been on the back foot with technological advancement and adaptation. And we've seen that the manufacturing sector has suffered as a consequence of that. They also have major political issues at play right now. And so if we look at Olaf Scholz, who is their chancellor since 2021, he's not sitting in a very pretty position right now because the electorate there has also become quite grumpy that he's in place and hasn't actually adequately, fought for what citizens want in Germany. If we look at who's likely to take over from there, again, we've got an election taking place on the 23rd of February. It does look as though the center-right, center-left alliance, the CDU-CSU, is the front runner to take that position. And as a close second, we've got the Alternative for Germany, which again speaks to the rising populism across many of the European counterparts. If we look across the European counterparts, there are a number of economies that either have caretaker governments or no government really in place right now. I think there's 6 at the moment that are flagging. And that shows that there's no real leadership taking place in Europe. Whereas even it might not be the leader that we want in America, but we do have Trump at the helm there. And so that is likely to keep, the dollar in quite a strong position relative to the euro over the next while. Also in Europe, we've got France, which is the second largest economy after Germany. And then we also have, a lame duck president with Emmanuel Macron in that position. And even though he's only expected to do an election in 2027 and he can't stand for another term, I do think that all the pressure on him might actually bring that election forward to this year. And, in the wings, we've got the far-right leader of the National Front, Marine Le Pen, who looks ready to take up that position. So I think, we're going to see a lot of political issues coming out of Europe and European growth remaining on the back foot.
As we like to do, let's bring it back home. The African Growth and Opportunities Act, also known as AGOA, was one of the key concerns for South Africa's economy under a Trump regime. Luckily, it was announced in late December that South Africa secured AGOA benefits for another year. However, challenges in this regard remain, because to obtain an extension beyond 2025, the legislation must be approved by the US Congress, where Republicans hold the majority after Trump's victory. Additionally, South Africa's external trade faces challenges due to growth below 1% in the Eurozone, as you've mentioned, and China's growth is expected to struggle to exceed 4.5% this year. Aside from external trade, what does South Africa's growth outlook look like for this year?
We are estimating that growth will pick up from below 1% last year to somewhere between 1.5% and 2% for this year. And I think, one of the biggest game changers in this regard has been the improvement in energy supply. And so if we look at what the South African Reserve Bank were estimating at the time, at the beginning of the year of 2024, they estimated that load shedding would shave off about 0.8 percentage points of growth, and then they revised that lower to 0.5. Now, we haven't had load shedding since the end of March, which means that 0.5 could even be lower. We also saw over the course of the holidays, we had Coburg Unit 2 being synchronized to the grid. So that adds another 930 megawatts of energy capacity to the system. So that's on the energy side. If we look at where growth is likely to come from in the next while, and we chat a little bit about the consumer, for household consumption, we think that a bit more growth will come through with real wage growth improving, because inflation is likely to average at a lower 4.2% this year. We think a little bit of employment growth might help. We think an additional 2 cuts in the interest rate. And again, I don't think we're going to get much more than that, given that worldwide we've seen that interest rate cut expectations have now been severely pulled back on the back of Trumponomics and what that would mean for a reflationary environment. There's also this additional angle of the early retirement withdrawals, and we saw that pension reform coming through in September of last year. The South African Reserve Bank were looking for around 40 billion of withdrawals in the last quarter for 2024, but they since revised that to 51 billion, and we think that quite a bit of that is going to end up again in consumption. For fixed investment, I think what we really need to see here is higher sentiment now starting to translate into broader-based improvements in fixed investment. So a lot has come through from renewables, and we've seen that the energy regulator of South Africa has suggested that the pipeline for renewables is very strong for this year and next, but we need to see that businesses start to actually invest more in South Africa. If we look, for example, in other parts of the economy, we don't think a lot is really going to come through from the government side of things. We think that the budget is still under, significant stress there. And as you've mentioned on the trade side, there are a number of headwinds. Now, I think what was quite nice at the end of 2024, we got an announcement from Standard & Poor's that, surprised markets a bit more favorably. I think people expected that announcement to come, but a bit later, maybe 2025. And they announced that they're going to lift the outlook on South Africa from neutral to positive. And I think that's a step in the right direction. But again, for us to see an actual rating upgrade, we do need to see that more reforms actually come through, not just on the energy space, but also on logistics and water and a number of other areas in the economy. We also saw Moody's taking that sentiment early on in this year, that they feel quite optimistic that South Africa has started this implementation of reform process. But of course, we know a lot more needs to be done. The other angle that I think, ratings hinge on is fiscal management in South Africa.
You mentioned that better fiscal management is important to South Africa, and I couldn't agree more. Going into the national budget, which will be tabled on the 19th of February, there are 3 things I worry about. 1, the size of government's wage bill, especially given the ongoing negotiations. A decision on the basic income grant, and the financial viability of our state-owned enterprises. What are your thoughts on these 3 risks to the fiscal outlook?
Let's take them one at a time. So if we take, the government wage bill, I think we do need to give Treasury credit where it's due. And we have actually seen that, the size of the wage bill relative to non-interest expenditure has come down a bit. But of course, it remains quite sizable. And now during the negotiation period, we've seen that government over the course of December lifted their offer from the low 4% to about 5%, but the labor union still wants 6%. So there is still a gap there. Treasury has said they could plug the gap by having early retirement taking place. We are still a little bit skeptical on how much that can actually, counter a larger wage bill, but we're yet to see on that one. What I think will help is if they do bed down a 3-year multi-year wage agreement, because it does mean, that we've got some certainty in the fiscal process for the next 3-year period. The second issue you mentioned is on the basic income grant. I do take a little bit of relief knowing that Treasury has penciled in an allocation for the social relief of distress grant extending into this fiscal year and the next. But of course, there are question marks around whether that is going to be changed into a basic income grant, whether that 350 Rand per recipient per month is going to be more, and whether more people are going to be eligible. And of course, that will push up the amount that government would then have to spend on that. And then the third element that you mentioned is, the ailing financial position of our state-owned entities. With regards to Eskom, even though they did get quite a chunky bailout from National Treasury already, we are quite worried about how they're going to pull out the distribution leg of Eskom. And the key worry here is that municipalities, as of November, according to the Business Day, owe Eskom about 95 billion Rand. So, that is quite a chunky number that hasn't yet come through in terms of non-payment. If we look at Transnet, I think, we've seen some positive developments with regards to the ports, particularly in Cape Town. One of the liquid bulk terminals was sold off in a 25-year lease to a private company. But then on the other hand, we've also got the Durban Port Terminal, where privatization plans here have been delayed. Transnet also, over the course of the holidays, came out with their statement, and that basically showed us that they made a loss of 2.2 billion Rand for the first 6 months of their financial year 2024-2025. And this is, even with some improvements coming through on railway volumes and some port alleviation constraints. So that tells us, that the security issues with Transnet are still there. The ailing infrastructure problems are still there. And that backlog, I don't think we have a firm estimate of what it's going to take in order to resolve Transnet's problems and what government would then have to pay out in order to resolve Transnet's issues.
That gives us a lot of economic food for thought as we dive into 2025. Thank you for joining me today, Sanisha.
Always great to dissect the economy with you, Tshiamo. Thank you.
Thank you for your time today, and we wish you all the best for 2025.